Picture yourself floating above an underwater city at twilight, watching as billions of tiny architects work together to build something magnificent. Below you, colors shift and pulse with life. Structures rise like cathedrals. And in the shadows between them, countless creatures go about their evening routines in ways most people never see. Welcome to Bedtime Biology, where science meets serenity. Each night, we explore the quiet wonders of the natural world, calming your mind and sparking your curiosity. Please like, subscribe, and comment below with where you're checking in from. Tonight, we're descending into one of Earth's most extraordinary ecosystems, a place where animals build cities, where partnerships shape survival, where the night transforms everything. We're exploring the secret life of coral reefs, and what you'll discover may change how you see the ocean forever. Most people, when they think of coral reefs, picture bright fish darting between colorful formations. They imagine tropical postcards, vacation memories, perhaps a snorkeling adventure where they floated above these underwater landscapes. And yes, that's part of the story. But it's only the very surface, the first page of a book with thousands of chapters, each one filled with mysteries that scientists are still working to understand. Because coral reefs aren't just beautiful, they're impossibly complex. They're ancient beyond imagination, and they're alive in ways that defy our usual understanding of what being alive means. These aren't rocks, though they feel like stone. They aren't plants, though they harvest energy from sunlight. They're animals, yes, but animals that have learned to partner with microscopic organisms in such intricate ways that neither can survive without the other. Tonight, as we move through these underwater cities together, we'll watch coral polyps extend their tentacles into the darkness. We'll witness spawning events that cloud the water with billions of future generations. We'll visit cleaning stations where fish line up like customers at a spa. We'll explore how these ecosystems communicate through chemistry, how they build themselves into mountains over millennia, and how they support a quarter of all marine life, despite occupying less than 1% of the ocean floor. So settle in, take a breath, and let's descend together into a world where every stone has a heartbeat, where cooperation is the language of survival, and where the secrets of life itself are written in calcium and sunlight. Let's begin at the smallest scale, with a creature you could barely see if you looked at it under a microscope. A creature so simple it might seem insignificant. And yet, when billions of these creatures work together over thousands of years, they build structures so vast they can be seen from space. This creature is called a coral polyp, and understanding it is the key to understanding everything else we'll explore tonight. A single coral polyp is, at its most basic, a tiny sac with a mouth surrounded by tentacles. That's it. In terms of body plan, it's remarkably simple. It belongs to a group of animals called cnidarians, which also includes jellyfish and sea anemones, creatures defined by their radial symmetry and their specialized stinging cells. Most individual polyps are no larger than a few millimeters across, though some species can grow to be several centimeters in diameter. If you were to look at one closely, you might think it resembled a miniature sea anemone, which makes sense because they're close relatives. But here's where the simplicity ends and the complexity begins. That soft body, that little sac, sits atop something hard. The polyp secretes calcium carbonate, the same mineral that makes up limestone, creating a protective cup-shaped skeleton beneath itself. This skeleton, made of a form of calcium carbonate called aragonite, becomes the polyp's home, a fortress it builds around itself using minerals extracted from seawater. The process is called calcification, and it's remarkable in its precision. The polyp pulls calcium ions and carbonate ions from the ocean and precipitates them into solid crystal structure, molecule by molecule, building its foundation grain by grain. Now, one polyp building one tiny skeleton might not seem like much, but coral polyps aren't solitary creatures. Most species are colonial, meaning that when a polyp reproduces asexually, the offspring doesn't drift away. Instead, it remains attached, building its own skeleton right next to its parent. And that offspring produces another, and another, and another. Over time, these polyps create massive colonies, thousands upon thousands of individuals living side by side. It's all connected by living tissue, all contributing to the same structure. This is how reefs are born, not from a single organism, but from the cumulative work of generations, each polyp adding its contribution to a structure that will outlive it by centuries. The coral head you might see while snorkeling, the one that looks like a boulder or a branching tree, might be composed of hundreds of thousands of individual polyps, all working together, all genetically identical, all descended from a single founding individual that settled on that spot decades or even centuries ago. But we still haven't reached the most fascinating part of this story, because inside the tissue of most reef-building corals, there lives another organism entirely. These are called zooxanthellae, and they're single-celled algae, microscopic dinoflagellates that have entered into one of the most successful partnerships in the history of life on Earth. The term zooxanthellae literally means little yellow animals, though they're not animals at all, but rather photosynthetic organisms that live within the coral cells. Most belong to the genus Symbiodinium, though scientists have recently discovered that this group is far more diverse than previously thought, containing multiple genera and hundreds or even thousands of distinct species, each with slightly different characteristics and tolerances. The relationship works like this. The coral provides the zooxanthellae with a safe home, protected inside its tissue, and gives them the raw materials they need for photosynthesis, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen compounds that the coral produces as waste. The zooxanthellae, in turn, use sunlight to manufacture sugars, glycerol, and amino acids through photosynthesis, and they share these energy-rich compounds with their coral host. In fact, scientists estimate that the zooxanthellae transfer up to 90% of what they produce directly to the coral polyp. This is not a small contribution. This is life support. The zooxanthellae provide so much energy that they satisfy up to 90% of the coral's nutritional needs. This partnership is what allows corals to build reefs in the first place. In the nutrient-poor waters of tropical oceans, where food is scarce and growth should be limited, this symbiosis creates productivity out of scarcity. The coral provides a structure. The zooxanthellae fill it with energy from the sun, and together they can calcify at rates that would be impossible for an animal feeding only on captured prey. This is why reef-building corals are found primarily in shallow, clear, tropical waters. The zooxanthellae need sunlight to photosynthesize, which means they can only thrive where light can penetrate. Most reef building occurs in waters less than 50 meters deep, though some hardy species can survive deeper if the water is clear enough. The corals also need warm water, with temperatures typically between 18 and 30 degrees Celsius, because both the coral's metabolism and the zooxanthellae's photosynthesis operate most efficiently within this range. The zooxanthellae are also responsible for much of the coral's colour. Those vivid yellows, browns, greens, and even some blues and purples come from the photosynthetic pigments inside the zooxanthellae. When you see a coral reef in full colour, you're seeing the visible manifestation of this partnership. The algae living within animal tissue, painting the reef in shades that advertise their presence. But this partnership, as beautiful and productive as it is, also creates vulnerability. The coral and its zooxanthellae exist in a delicate balance, one that can be disrupted by changes in temperature, light, or water chemistry. When the coral becomes stressed, particularly by heat, it expels its zooxanthellae in a desperate physiological response. This is called coral bleaching, and we'll explore it in more depth later, but for now, understand this. When the zooxanthellae are gone, the coral loses both its colour and its primary food source. What remains is the white calcium carbonate skeleton showing through the now transparent tissue, a ghost of what the coral once was. Some corals can recover if conditions improve quickly, enough reacquiring zooxanthellae from the surrounding water. But if the stress persists, if the bleaching lasts too long, the coral will starve and die. Scientists have only recently begun to understand how diverse and complex the zooxanthellae community actually is. What was once thought to be a single species, Symbiodinium microadriaticum, turns out to be an enormous group spanning multiple genera and containing vast genetic diversity. Research using molecular techniques has revealed that zooxanthellae can be divided into distinct clades, labelled A through E and beyond, each with different thermal tolerances, different photosynthetic efficiencies, and different relationships with their hosts. Some corals harbour multiple types of zooxanthellae simultaneously, while others are highly specific about which types they host. This diversity matters because it affects how resilient different corals are to environmental stress. Corals hosting heat-tolerant zooxanthellae may survive warming waters that would kill corals with more sensitive symbionts. The relationship between coral and zooxanthellae has existed for approximately 160 million years, dating back to the age of dinosaurs. This partnership evolved during a period of increasing coral diversity and has persisted through multiple mass extinction events, through ice ages and warm periods, through dramatic changes in ocean chemistry. The longevity of this symbiosis speaks to its fundamental effectiveness, to the evolutionary advantage it provides. But it also means that modern corals have evolved to depend on this relationship so completely that they cannot easily adapt to losing it. Yet even with all the energy the zooxanthellae provide, corals are not purely passive recipients of photosynthetic products. They are also active hunters. At night, when photosynthesis stops, coral polyps extend their tentacles fully, transforming from light harvesters into predators. Those tentacles are armed with specialized cells called cnidocytes, which contain structures called nematocysts, essentially tiny harpoons loaded with toxins. When a small organism, a copepod, a larval fish, a fragment of zooplankton, brushes against the tentacle, the nematocyst fires, injecting venom that stuns or kills the prey. The tentacles then curl inward, bringing the captured food to the polyp's mouth, where it's digested in a simple gut cavity. This hunting supplements the coral's diet, providing nitrogen, phosphorus, and other nutrients that the zooxanthellae cannot supply. Some coral species are more active hunters than others, with larger polyps and longer tentacles that can capture bigger prey. The balance between photosynthesis and predation varies by species and by environmental conditions. In clear, sunlit waters, corals may rely more heavily on their zooxanthellae. In more turbid or deeper waters, or during times when plankton is abundant, active feeding becomes more important. The coral polyp's body, simple as it appears, is actually quite sophisticated. It has a layer of cells called the gastrodermis lining its gut cavity, and these cells are where many of the zooxanthellae reside, safely housed within specialized compartments. The outer layer, called the epidermis, faces the ocean and contains the cnidocytes and other specialized cells. Between these two layers is a jelly-like substance called mesoglea, which in corals is often quite thin. There's no brain, no centralized nervous system, but there is a nerve net, a diffuse network of neurons that allows the polyp to respond to stimuli, to contract when threatened, to coordinate the movement of tentacles toward prey. And then there's the skeleton beneath all of this, growing constantly, adding layers, recording the coral's life in bands much like tree rings. Scientists can core these skeletons and read them like history books, determining ages, tracking growth rates, even reconstructing past ocean conditions by analyzing the isotopes and trace elements incorporated into the calcium carbonate. Some massive coral colonies, particularly in species like porites, have been growing for hundreds of years, making them among the oldest living organisms on Earth. These coral colonies were alive before European colonization of many parts of the world, before the Industrial Revolution, before human activities began to significantly alter the planet's climate and oceans. When you understand what a coral polyp is, when you grasp the elegance of this partnership between animal and alga, when you appreciate the patience required to build these structures over generations, you begin to see coral reefs not as static formations, but as living archives, as monuments to persistence, as proof that complexity can emerge from simplicity when time and cooperation are given room to work. If all corals were the same, reefs would be monotonous places. But they're not. The diversity of coral species is staggering, and each brings its own architecture, its own growth strategy, its own contribution to the reef's structure and ecology. Scientists have identified over 6,000 species of corals worldwide, though not all of them build reefs. The reef builders belong primarily to an order called Scleractinia, the stony corals, which are characterized by their ability to secrete substantial calcium carbonate skeletons. These are the primary architects of coral reefs, the species responsible for creating the three-dimensional structure that defines these ecosystems. Beyond the stony corals, there are also soft corals, octocorals like sea fans and sea whips, which have a more flexible structure supported by protein rather than massive calcification. These soft corals add movement and variety to the reef, but don't contribute much to its permanent framework. Among the stony corals, the variety of forms is remarkable. Some corals grow as massive boulders, slow and steady, building robust structures that can withstand powerful storms. Brain corals, so named because their surface resembles the convolutions of a human brain, can form enormous hemispheres several meters across, each one representing hundreds of years of growth. These massive corals are the bedrock of many reefs, the stable foundations that endure through hurricanes and environmental fluctuations. A single brain coral colony might contain thousands of individual polyps, all connected by sheets of living tissue, all sharing resources, all contributing to the colony's growth and maintenance. Other corals adopt a branching strategy, growing like trees or staghorns, reaching upward and outward to capture light and feeding currents. Staghorn corals and elkhorn corals in the Caribbean, or Acropora species throughout the Indo-Pacific, grow relatively quickly for corals, adding several centimeters per year compared to the millimeters or less typical of massive species. These branching corals create complex three-dimensional habitats, forests of calcium carbonate where fish can hide from predators, and small invertebrates can find shelter. However, their branching structure also makes them more fragile. A strong storm can break these corals into fragments, though ironically, this fragility can also serve as a means of reproduction, as broken fragments that land on suitable substrate can continue growing and establish new colonies. Then there are the platin corals, species that grow as broad, flat sheets, maximizing their surface area to capture light for their zooxanthellae. In deeper water or on steep reef slopes, you might see these corals arranged like shingles on a roof, each plate slightly overlapping the one below, all angled to catch what sunlight filters down through the water. Some plating corals can shade the corals beneath them, competing for light in a silent, slow-motion battle for resources that plays out over years. Coral colonies also differ in their reproductive strategies. Some are hermaphrodites, producing both eggs and sperm within the same colony. Others are gonochoric, meaning individual colonies are either male or female, though you couldn't tell by looking at them. These reproductive differences influence how corals participate in the mass spawning events we'll explore later, and they affect the genetic diversity within coral populations. The colors we see in corals come from multiple sources. As mentioned, the zooxanthellae contribute browns, yellows, and greens from their photosynthetic pigments. But corals also produce their own pigments, proteins that can fluoresce under certain wavelengths of light, creating brilliant blues, purples, pinks, and even reds. These fluorescent proteins serve multiple functions. Some protect the zooxanthellae from excessive light by absorbing harmful ultraviolet wavelengths. Others may help distribute light more evenly throughout the coral tissue, enhancing photosynthesis in areas that might otherwise be shaded. And some, scientists suspect, might serve purposes we don't yet fully understand, perhaps playing roles in stress responses or communication with other organisms. Under normal light, these fluorescent proteins contribute to the overall color palette of the reef, but they truly shine under ultraviolet illumination. If you could visit a coral reef at night with a UV flashlight and special filters, you would see the reef transformed into a psychedelic landscape of glowing colors, each coral species producing its own signature hues. This phenomenon has captivated both scientists and underwater photographers, revealing a hidden spectrum of beauty that exists but remains invisible to our eyes under normal conditions. The geographic distribution of coral species varies dramatically around the world. The Indo-Pacific region, particularly the area known as the Coral Triangle, which encompasses parts of Indonesia, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, the Solomon Islands, and Timor-Leste, contains the highest diversity of coral species on Earth. This region is home to approximately 605 species, representing over 75% of all known coral species globally. The epicenter of this diversity is in the Bird's Head Peninsula of Indonesian Papua, where you can find over 570 species in a relatively small area. This concentration of biodiversity makes the Coral Triangle one of the most important regions for coral conservation, a living library of genetic diversity that may prove crucial as corals face increasing environmental pressures. The Caribbean, by contrast, has lower coral diversity, with only around 65 species. But these corals have evolved in relative isolation, developing unique characteristics and filling specific ecological niches. Caribbean reefs have their own character, their own assemblages of species, and their own conservation challenges. The Atlantic Ocean acts as a barrier that has largely prevented coral larvae from the Indo-Pacific from colonizing the Caribbean, and vice versa, leading to distinct evolutionary trajectories on either side of the ocean. Coral growth rates vary by species and environmental conditions, but they're universally slow by human standards. Massive corals like porites might grow only a few millimeters per year, while faster-growing branching corals like acropora might add up to 10 centimeters annually. This means that a coral head the size of a basketball might be decades old, while a massive boulder coral several meters across could be centuries old. The Great Barrier Reef, the world's largest coral reef system, stretching over 2,000 kilometers along Australia's northeastern coast, has been growing for approximately 8,000 years, since the end of the last ice age, when rising sea levels flooded the continental shelf and created conditions suitable for reef development. To build a reef requires not just coral growth, but also a balance between construction and destruction. Reefs are under constant assault from bioeroders, organisms that break down the calcium carbonate structure. Parrotfish scrape and bite corals with their beak-like teeth, extracting algae and breaking off pieces of skeleton in the process, eventually excreting this material as fine sand. A single large parrotfish can produce hundreds of kilograms of sand per year through this feeding behavior. Sea urchins also graze on reefs, wearing away at the carbonate structure. Sponges bore into the reef framework, creating networks of tunnels. Various species of worms and mollusks drill into coral skeletons, creating holes and weakening the structure. For a reef to grow, the rate of calcification by corals and coralline algae must exceed the rate of erosion and bioerosion. When this balance shifts, when erosion outpaces construction, reefs can begin to break down, losing their three-dimensional complexity and becoming flatter, less diverse habitats. Maintaining this balance requires healthy coral populations, which in turn requires stable environmental conditions, adequate water quality, and minimal human disturbance. Different coral species occupy different zones on the reef, sorted by their tolerance for wave energy, light availability, and other physical factors. On the reef crest, the highest point of the reef, where waves break most violently, you find the toughest species, often including crustose coralline algae and robust corals that can withstand the constant pounding. Just below the crest, on the fore-reef slope, conditions are usually ideal for coral growth, with good light, strong currents, bringing nutrients and oxygen, and enough wave energy to prevent sediment from smothering the corals. This zone often displays the highest coral cover and diversity. Deeper down the slope, as light diminishes, you find shade-tolerant species, often those with broader surface areas or more efficient zooxanthellae. In the lagoon behind a barrier reef, where water is calmer but maybe murkier and experience greater temperature fluctuations, different coral assemblages develop, dominated by species adapted to these less stable conditions. Understanding coral diversity matters not just for appreciating the reef's beauty, but for recognizing its vulnerability. Each species has its own tolerances, its own sensitivities to heat, acidity, and other stressors. As ocean conditions change, some species will prove more resilient than others. The loss of any species represents a loss of genetic diversity, a loss of specific functions that species provided, and a reduction in the reef's overall ability to adapt to changing conditions. Coral reefs are not interchangeable, and the loss of diversity in one region cannot be compensated by diversity elsewhere. Each reef, each species, each population represents unique evolutionary history and ecological relationships that, once lost, cannot be recovered. Stand on the shore and look out at a coral reef, and you might think the corals themselves are the main attraction. But zoom in, look closer, and you'll discover that the reef is teeming with so much life that it defies easy comprehension. Coral reefs are often called the rainforests of the sea, and the comparison is apt. Despite occupying less than 1% of the ocean floor, coral reefs support an estimated 25% of all marine life. More than 4,000 species of fish depend on coral reefs at some point in their life cycle, along with countless invertebrates, marine mammals, sea turtles, and an entire web of microorganisms that we're only beginning to understand. Let's start with the fish, because they're often the most visible and the most charismatic. Reef fish display a spectrum of colors and patterns that seems almost exaggerated, as if evolution was showing off. There are good reasons for this riot of color. In the complex environment of the reef, with its endless nooks and crevices, visual signals matter. Bright colors can advertise territory, signal readiness to mate, or warn potential predators that a fish is toxic or dangerous. Some patterns help fish blend into the reef's background, breaking up their outline and making them harder to spot. Others do the opposite, making the fish highly visible, useful for species that defend feeding or breeding territories and want to be seen by competitors. Parrotfish are among the most important herbivores on the reef, grazing on algae that grows on dead coral surfaces and on the reef substrate. Their teeth are fused into a beak-like structure, and they use this beak to scrape algae off the reef, often taking chunks of coral skeleton along with it. What goes in must come out, and parrotfish excrete what they've processed as fine white sand. If you've ever walked on a tropical beach and felt that impossibly soft sand beneath your feet, there's a good chance you were walking on parrotfish waste. A single large parrotfish can produce hundreds of pounds of sand per year, making them significant contributors to beach formation in the tropics. But their role goes beyond sand production. By keeping algae in check, parrotfish help prevent algae from overgrowing the reef and smothering corals. In areas where parrotfish populations have been depleted by overfishing, algae often proliferates, preventing new corals from settling and reducing the reef's ability to recover from disturbances. Butterflyfish are another distinctive family, known for their delicate, often circular shapes and their tendency to form monogamous pairs. Many butterfly fishes feed directly on coral polyps, using their elongated snouts to reach into the coral structure and nip off individual polyps. This feeding behavior makes them closely tied to coral health. Studies have found strong correlations between butterfly fish abundance and coral cover, making butterfly fishes useful indicators of reef condition. When coral cover declines, butterfly fish populations typically follow. Wrasses are among the most diverse families on the reef, with species ranging from tiny darting fish, barely an inch long, to massive Napoleon wrasses that can exceed 6 feet in length and weigh over 400 pounds. Many wrasses exhibit remarkable color changes as they mature, with juveniles, females, and males of the same species looking completely different from one another. Some wrasses start life as females and later transition to males, a strategy called sequential hermaphroditism. This flexibility allows small groups to maintain breeding populations even when sex ratios become skewed. Groupers are the apex predators of many reefs, large-bodied fish with powerful jaws that can swallow prey whole. They're ambush predators, often lurking in caves or beneath overhangs, waiting for smaller fish to swim within striking distance. Groupers can live for decades, growing slowly but eventually reaching impressive sizes. Unfortunately, their long lifespans and late maturity also make them vulnerable to overfishing. In many parts of the world, grouper populations have been severely depleted, which has cascading effects on the reef ecosystem. With fewer top predators, populations of smaller predators can increase, which in turn affects populations of herbivores and other species lower in the food web. Then there are the cleaner fish, small species that provide a vital service by removing parasites, dead tissue, and other unwanted material from larger fish. The cleaner wrasse is perhaps the most famous example. These small, striped fish establish cleaning stations, specific locations on the reef where other fish come to be cleaned. A fish seeking cleaning will often adopt a specific posture, swimming unusually slowly or hovering in place, and sometimes changing color, all signals that indicate to the cleaner that it's safe to approach. The cleaner wrasser then moves over and sometimes into the client fish, picking off parasites and even entering the mouth and gills to clean inside. This service is so valuable that even large predators that would normally eat a fish the size of a cleaner wrasse will refrain, waiting patiently to be cleaned. But fish are only part of the story. The invertebrate diversity on coral reefs is staggering, and many of these species play crucial roles in reef functioning. Crustaceans are particularly abundant and diverse. Crabs, shrimps, lobsters, and mantis shrimps occupy virtually every available niche. Some live commensally with corals, hiding among branches and feeding on drifting plankton. Others are active predators, hunting at night across the reef substrate. Cleaner shrimp, like their fish counterparts, establish cleaning stations where fish come to have parasites removed. Mollusks are another major group. Snails graze on algae, their rasping tongues wearing microscopic grooves into the reef substrate. Some species, like cone snails, are venomous predators, harpooning prey with toxic barbs. Giant clams, the largest bivalves in the world, can grow to over 4 feet long and weigh hundreds of pounds. Like corals, giant clams house zooxanthellae in their colourful mantles, obtaining much of their nutrition from photosynthesis, while also filter feeding from the water. Sea urchins are important grazers, particularly in the Caribbean, where the long-spined sea urchin Diadema antillarum once played a crucial role in controlling algae. In the early 1980s, a disease swept through Caribbean reefs, killing over 95% of these urchins. The loss of this keystone herbivore contributed to phase shifts on many reefs, where algae overgrew corals and reefs transitioned from coral-dominated to algae-dominated states. The urchin populations have been slow to recover, and their absence continues to affect Caribbean reef dynamics decades later. Echinoderms beyond urchins include sea stars, which come in dazzling variety. Most are predators or scavengers, but one species in particular, the crown of thorns sea star, can have devastating impacts on reefs. This large, multi-armed sea star feeds on coral polyps, and when its populations explode, as they do periodically on the Great Barrier Reef and other Indo-Pacific reefs, these outbreaks can consume vast areas of living coral, leaving behind bleached skeletons. The causes of these outbreaks are debated, but may involve a combination of natural cycles, nutrient runoff from land that enhances larval survival, and removal of natural predators by fishing. Sponges are often overlooked, but incredibly important. These simple animals filter enormous amounts of water, feeding on bacteria and tiny organic particles. Some sponges live on the reef surface, adding splashes of colour and variety. Others bore into the coral skeleton, creating networks of tunnels that contribute to bioerosion. Sponges also play a crucial role in nutrient cycling, converting dissolved organic matter into sponge tissue that's then available to sponge predators, creating what scientists call the sponge loop that helps retain nutrients within the reef ecosystem. Tunicates, or sea squirts, are another ancient group. Though they may look like simple sacs attached to the reef, they're actually chordate, more closely related to vertebrates than to sponges or cnidarians. They filter feed like sponges, but have a more complex internal structure. The cryptofauna, the hidden animals living within the reef framework itself, remain largely unknown. Studies where scientists have dissolved chunks of coral reef skeleton in acid and counted what emerges have revealed hundreds of species in a single coral head, most of them previously undescribed. These tiny worms, crustaceans, mollusks, and other creatures live in the dark spaces within the reef, feeding on detritus, bacteria, and each other, forming complex food webs that we're only beginning to map. Even marine mammals visit coral reefs, though they don't live there permanently. Dolphins sometimes hunt along reef edges, using the reef to trap fish against a barrier. In some areas, spinner dolphins rest in reef lagoons during the day, before heading offshore to feed at night. Dugongs, large marine mammals related to manatees, graze on seagrass beds, often associated with reefs. And in a few locations, humpback whales use the calm waters near reefs as nursery areas, where mothers give birth and nurse their calves before migrating to colder feeding grounds. Sea turtles are regular reef visitors. Green turtles graze on algae and seagrass. Hawksbill turtles feed on sponges, using their hawk-like beaks to pull sponges from crevices. Turtles may travel hundreds or thousands of miles between feeding grounds and nesting beaches, yet they often return to the same reefs year after year, somehow navigating across vast expanses of open ocean to find these underwater oases. The diversity on coral reefs creates complexity, and complexity creates stability, up to a point. With so many species occupying so many niches, reefs can often withstand the loss of a few species without collapsing, as other species expand to fill empty roles. But this resilience has limits. Remove too many herbivores, and algae can overwhelm corals. Remove too many predators, and prey populations can explode, consuming resources unsustainably. disrupt the physical structure by killing corals, and many of the species that depend on that structure will disappear as well. Understanding reef biodiversity isn't just an exercise in cataloguing species. It's about recognizing the intricate connections between organisms, the way each species depends on others, the way the ecosystem functions as a whole. Coral reefs are not just collections of species living in the same place. They're integrated systems where structure creates habitat, where mutualism enables productivity, where predation controls populations, and where nutrient cycling sustains life in otherwise nutrient-poor waters. If you visit a coral reef during the day and then return at night, you might wonder if you've come to the same place. The transformation is profound, almost magical. The fish that dominated the daytime reef, the bright butterfly fishes and parrotfishes and damselfish, disappear into crevices to sleep, their colours fading in the darkness. And in their place emerge entirely different animals, creatures you rarely see in daylight, moving with purpose through the darkness. The reef at night belongs to the predators and to the creatures they hunt. As the sun sets and light begins to fade from the water, coral polyps undergo their own transformation. During the day, with photosynthesis in full swing, many polyps remain partially or fully retracted, their tentacles pulled in, their tissue covering their skeletons in a relatively smooth layer. The zooxanthellae inside are busy harvesting light, producing sugars and lipids that feed the coral. But when darkness arrives and photosynthesis ceases, the polyps expand, extending their tentacles out into the water column, transforming the reef surface from relatively smooth to fuzzy, from sleepy to actively hunting. These tentacles, armed with their nematocysts, wave gently in the current, waiting for contact with prey. Coral reefs exist in nutrient-poor tropical waters, but they're not devoid of life. Each night, zooplankton, copepods, larval fish, small crustaceans, and other tiny drifting organisms undergo what's called diel vertical migration, one of the largest daily movements of biomass on Earth. These creatures spend their days in deeper, darker water, where they're safer from visual predators. But at night, they rise toward the surface to feed on phytoplankton and other microorganisms. And in doing so, they pass over coral reefs, where hungry polyps are waiting. When a copepod or other zooplankton brushes against a coral tentacle, the nematocysts fire in less than a millisecond, one of the fastest cellular processes known. The prey is injected with toxins that paralyze or kill it, and the tentacles curl inward, bringing the meal to the polyp's mouth. For such simple animals, corals are remarkably effective predators. They can't chase their prey, but they don't need to. They simply wait, tentacles extended like a living net, and let the current bring food to them. Different coral species have different feeding strategies and capabilities. Species with larger polyps and longer tentacles can capture larger prey. Some corals actively produce mucus nets that trap particles and organic matter, which the coral then reels in and digests. Others are more passive, relying primarily on chance encounters between prey and tentacles. The importance of this feeding varies by species and environmental conditions. In clear waters with high light and healthy zooxanthellae populations, corals may derive 90% or more of their energy from photosynthesis, with predation providing supplemental nutrients. In cloudier or deeper waters, or when zooxanthellae are stressed or absent, active feeding becomes much more important to survival. But corals aren't the only ones feeding. In fact, the entire character of the reef community changes after dark. Fish species that were invisible during the day emerge from hiding spots. Squirrelfish and soldierfish, with their large eyes adapted for low-light vision, venture out from caves where they spent the day. These fish have reflective layers in their eyes, similar to cats, that enhance their ability to see in dim light, giving them an advantage in the nocturnal environment. Cardinal fish, small but abundant on many reefs, come alive at night. During the day, they hover in groups beneath coral overhangs and in caves, barely moving. But at night, they disperse across the reef to feed on zooplankton, their enormous eyes and large mouths allowing them to detect and capture prey in near-complete darkness. Some cardinal fish species are mouth brooders, with males incubating eggs in their mouths for weeks, abstaining from feeding during this period to protect their developing offspring. Octopuses emerge from their dens to hunt. These invertebrate predators are masters of camouflage, changing both their color and the texture of their skin to blend seamlessly with the reef. An octopus hunting at night moves with fluid grace, probing into crevices with its flexible arms, searching for crabs, shrimp, and sleeping fish. Their intelligence is remarkable. They can learn, solve problems, remember solutions, and even use tools. If you shine a light on a hunting octopus, it may freeze, then slowly begin to match the colors and patterns of its surroundings, demonstrating in real time its extraordinary control over its appearance. Moray eels, fearsome looking but usually quite shy during the day, become active hunters at night. They use their excellent sense of smell to track prey through the reef's labyrinth. Unlike most fish, morays can swim backwards, a useful adaptation for creatures that spend much of their time in tight spaces. They often hunt cooperatively with groupers, with the grouper herding prey into crevices where the eel can follow, and both predators benefiting from the partnership. Lobsters venture out of their hiding spots, walking across the reef on their long legs, their antennae waving, detecting chemical traces of carrion or potential prey. Crabs scuttle from shadow to shadow, some hunting, others scavenging, all more active under the cover of darkness. Sea urchins that remained hidden during the day emerge to graze, particularly species like diadema, which can aggregate in large numbers and have significant impacts on algae abundance. Their long spines provide protection from most predators, though some fish, like triggerfish, have learned to flip urchins over to access their less defended underside. Even the sand itself comes alive at night. Bristleworms emerge from the substrate, their many segments undulating as they crawl across the bottom searching for food. Sea cucumbers, looking like oversized slugs, creep across the sand, ingesting sediment and extracting organic matter from it. Starfish that were hidden during the day move across the reef with surprising speed for their usual languid reputation, seeking prey or scavenging opportunities. Some fish that are active during the day continue hunting at night, but use different strategies. Trevally, jacks, and other predators may work together, herding baitfish against the reef or into tight balls where they're easier to catch. These hunting parties can be chaotic and exciting to witness, with the water exploding in flashes of silver as baitfish try desperately to escape and predators slash through the schools. But perhaps the most dramatic nighttime events on coral reefs are the spawning aggregations of certain fish species. Groupers, snappers, and other species gather in massive numbers at specific locations and specific times, sometimes traveling hundreds of kilometers to reach these spawning sites. The fish aggregate for just a few nights each year, timed with particular phases of the moon, and release enormous clouds of eggs and sperm into the water. These aggregations are spectacular, representing the culmination of seasonal cycles and precise biological timing. Sadly, they also make the fish incredibly vulnerable to overfishing, and many spawning aggregations have been fished out, with devastating impacts on fish populations across entire regions. The nighttime reef is also when many settlement events occur. Larval fish, after spending days or weeks drifting in the open ocean, often settle onto the reef at night, perhaps to avoid visual predators. They arrive in pulses, sometimes in enormous numbers, seeking suitable habitat where they can establish territories and begin their lives as reef residents. For many species, this is the most dangerous time of their lives. Mortality during settlement is extraordinarily high, with most larvae eaten within hours of arriving on the reef. Some creatures use the night for travel. Octopuses and some crabs may move between different parts of the reef, or between the reef and adjacent habitats, like seagrass beds or mangroves, using darkness as cover. Some fish species that feed in one area by day return to different sleeping locations at night, making regular commutes across the reef as light levels change. The sensory world of the nighttime reef is very different from the daytime. Vision becomes less useful, and other senses take precedence. Many nocturnal predators rely heavily on chemoreception, detecting chemical traces in the water to locate prey. Some fish have evolved enhanced lateral line systems, networks of sensors along their sides that detect minute pressure changes in the water, allowing them to sense the movement of prey even in complete darkness. These non-visual senses open up the reef to predation in ways that would be impossible during the day, when visual prey could more easily avoid approaching predators. Bioluminescence occasionally flickers through the reef at night. Some plankton emit light when disturbed, creating sparkles in the water. Certain fish, particularly in deeper water, have light-producing organs that they use for communication, camouflage, or luring prey. While bioluminescence is less common on shallow reefs than in the deep sea, it still adds to the otherworldly quality of the nighttime reef environment. For human observers, diving a reef at night is an entirely different experience from diving during the day. The creatures you see, the behaviors you witness, even the colors you perceive under artificial light, all differ dramatically. Many reef photographers and scientists prefer night diving precisely because it reveals aspects of reef ecology that remain hidden during the day. It's a reminder that our understanding of these ecosystems is still incomplete, that there are entire dimensions of reef life that operate on schedules and in ways we're only beginning to document. The night also brings its challenges for reef organisms. Reduced visibility means greater vulnerability to predators for some species, which is why so many herbivorous fish hide at night. Energy must be conserved, as there's no photosynthetic income during dark hours. Corals use this time to feed, trying to supplement the energy provided by their zooxanthellae. But they're also using energy to maintain themselves, to secrete skeleton, to grow. The balance between energy intake and expenditure is delicate, and anything that disrupts it, whether environmental stress, disease, or predation, can push a coral toward negative energy balance and eventual mortality. Understanding the nighttime reef helps us appreciate the full picture of how these ecosystems function. It reveals behaviors and relationships that would remain invisible if we only observed during daylight hours. It shows us that coral reefs are active, dynamic systems around the clock, that the pulse of life on the reef never truly stops. It only changes rhythm as day gives way to night and night returns to day. There are nights on coral reefs when something extraordinary happens, events so spectacular that people who witness them speak of them in almost mystical terms. These are the nights when corals spawn, when entire reefs simultaneously release their reproductive cells into the water, creating underwater snowstorms of eggs and sperm, pink and white and orange bundles rising through the water column like reverse rain. This is mass spawning, and it's one of the most remarkable reproductive strategies in the natural world. For most of the year, coral reproduction proceeds quietly and invisibly. Many corals reproduce asexually through fragmentation, where broken pieces that land on suitable substrate can grow into new colonies. This allows corals to spread across the reef and recover from physical damage. But asexual reproduction creates genetic clones, and while this is useful for colonizing space and recovering from disturbances, it doesn't generate the genetic diversity necessary for adaptation and evolution. For that, corals need sexual reproduction, and most coral species are broadcast spawners, meaning they release their gametes into the water, where fertilization occurs externally. The challenge with this strategy is coordination. Coral colonies are sessile. They can't move to find mates, and even colonies of the same species may be separated by considerable distances. For fertilization to occur, the eggs and sperm from different colonies need to encounter each other in the vast ocean, which seems like an impossible task given the dilution that would occur if each colony released its gametes randomly. The solution is synchrony. If all the corals of a given species release their gametes at the same time, the concentration of eggs and sperm in the water becomes high enough that fertilization can occur efficiently. And remarkably, this is exactly what happens on many coral reefs. Once a year, usually on just a few nights, corals undergo mass synchronous spawning, with dozens or even hundreds of species releasing their gametes within hours of each other. The timing of these spawning events is remarkably precise and is triggered by a combination of environmental cues. Water temperature is important. Spawning typically occurs during warmer months when gamete development proceeds more quickly. Day length matters, as it changes predictably through the year and provides a reliable signal. But the most critical cue appears to be the phase of the moon. On the Great Barrier Reef, mass spawning typically occurs on a few nights following the full moon in late spring, November or December in the southern hemisphere. The coral polyps have been developing their gametes internally for months, with eggs growing visible within the polyp's tissue, to the point where you can sometimes see them through the translucent body wall. As the full moon approaches, the corals are ready, waiting for the final signals that will trigger release. Scientists believe the moon matters for several reasons. The gravitational effects of the moon influence tides, and corals may be able to sense these tidal cycles. The moonlight itself may also serve as a cue, with corals potentially detecting changes in light intensity during different phases of the moon. Recent research has identified light-sensitive proteins in corals that may respond to moonlight, providing a biological mechanism for detecting lunar cycles. The timing of spawning relative to the lunar cycle has practical implications beyond just synchronizing release. In many locations, tides are at their weakest, called NERP tides, in the period following the full moon. Weaker tides mean less water movement, which may help keep gamete clouds concentrated and increase fertilization success. Additionally, spawning a few days after the full moon means that nights are still relatively bright, which may help larvae with predator avoidance or finding suitable settlement habitat. The exact hour of spawning is often tied to the time after sunset. On some reefs, spawning begins 2 or 3 hours after dark, while on others it might occur closer to midnight. This timing may be related to optimal tidal conditions, or may represent a compromise that minimizes the time when larvae are vulnerable to nocturnal predators, while still allowing for fertilization to occur during darkness. When spawning begins, it's a sight unlike anything else in nature. The corals release small bundles, packages containing both eggs and sperm, that float upward through the water, buoyant due to lipids within the eggs. In species that produce egg-sperm bundles, these packages are typically pink, orange, or red, and they emerge from the polyp's mouth, drifting up like tiny balloons. Different species release their bundles at slightly different times over the course of a few hours, creating waves of spawning that move across the reef. The water becomes thick with these bundles, so many that visibility can drop to just a few meters. Divers and snorkelers present during spawning events describe it as being in an underwater snowstorm, except the snow is rising rather than falling. The surface of the water can become covered with a slick of eggs and sperm, creating a pink or orange film, visible from boats or even from shore on particularly intense spawning nights. Once the bundles reach the surface, they break apart, releasing the eggs and sperm. Fertilization occurs quickly, within a few hours. The timing is critical because sperm remain viable for only a short period. Studies have shown that fertilization success drops dramatically if sperm are diluted, or if spawning is even slightly asynchronous. Eggs spawned one night have very low fertilization success if most of the population spawned the previous night. After fertilization, the resulting embryos develop into planular larvae, tiny swimming organisms that look nothing like the adult coral. These larvae spend anywhere from a few days to several weeks drifting in ocean currents, dispersed by winds and waves. This planktonic phase is crucial for coral distribution, allowing corals to colonize new areas and maintain genetic connectivity between distant reefs. Some larvae settle close to their parent colony, but others travel hundreds or even thousands of kilometers before finding suitable habitat. The larvae are selective about where they settle. They're seeking hard substrate, ideally already covered with a thin film of coralline algae or bacteria, in an area with appropriate light levels and water flow. They'll reject unsuitable substrates, continuing to search until they find something appropriate, or until they run out of energy reserves and perish. Once a larva finds suitable habitat, it undergoes metamorphosis, transforming from a swimming larva into a sessile polyp, cementing itself in place, beginning to secrete its skeleton, and starting the process that could, if it survives, lead to a centuries-old colony. Not all corals participate in mass spawning. Some species are brooders, meaning fertilization occurs internally, and the coral releases fully formed planular larvae rather than eggs and sperm. Brooded larvae typically spend less time in the plankton and settle closer to their parent colony. This reduces dispersal, but increases the chance that larvae will find suitable habitat similar to where their parents thrived. The evolutionary advantages of mass spawning are significant. By releasing gametes simultaneously, corals achieve high fertilization success despite being sessile and separated. The sudden abundance of eggs and larvae can overwhelm predators, a phenomenon called predator satiation. While fish, sea cucumbers, and many other animals do feed heavily during spawning events, the sheer quantity of reproductive material is so great that most escapes predation. The synchrony also ensures that genetically diverse offspring are produced, as gametes from many different colonies mix together, increasing the genetic variation in the resulting generation. However, mass spawning also creates vulnerabilities. If environmental conditions shift such that the cues triggering spawning become less reliable, or if mortality during the larval phase increases, entire year classes can fail. With many species spawning just once a year, any disruption to that single reproductive event can have serious population consequences. Climate change is affecting the timing and success of spawning events. Rising temperatures can cause spawning to occur earlier in the season, or can lead to partial spawning, where some colonies release gametes while others fail to do so, reducing synchrony and fertilization success. Artificial light pollution is an emerging threat to coral spawning. Recent studies have found that corals exposed to artificial light at night from coastal development or offshore structures often spawn earlier than corals in darker locations, sometimes by several days. This can break up the synchrony that makes mass spawning successful, as corals spawning out of sync with the majority have much lower fertilization rates. The disruption of spawning timing due to light pollution represents a new and insidious threat to coral reproduction, one that operates invisibly and that's difficult to mitigate. Scientists are also working to understand and predict spawning events with greater precision. Being able to forecast spawning nights allows researchers to collect gametes for restoration projects, growing coral larvae in controlled settings before transplanting them to degraded reefs. This assisted reproduction is becoming an important tool in reef restoration efforts, though it's labor-intensive and can only be done on the few nights each year when spawning occurs. Witnessing a mass spawning event in person is considered one of the great privileges of marine biology and underwater photography. The experience of floating in water filled with drifting gametes, knowing you're watching the reef reproduce itself, seeing a process that has occurred for millions of years, creates a profound sense of connection to the natural world and its cycles. It's a reminder that these seemingly static ecosystems are dynamic, constantly renewing themselves, constantly producing the next generation that will build the reefs of the future. Survival on a coral reef requires more than individual strength or speed. It requires partnerships, relationships built over evolutionary timescales, where two or more species have learned to live together in ways that benefit them all. These symbiotic relationships are everywhere on the reef, from the microscopic partnerships between corals and their zooxanthellae to the highly visible interactions at cleaning stations where fish patiently wait in line for a health checkup. We've already explored the coral zooxanthellae partnership in depth, but it's worth emphasizing again just how central this relationship is to reef existence. Without zooxanthellae, corals would be unable to build reefs in nutrient-poor tropical waters. The productivity this partnership creates enables everything else on the reef. In a very real sense, coral reefs are built on mutualism, on the benefits that emerge when two organisms cooperate rather than compete. But this is far from the only mutualistic relationship on the reef. Let's visit a cleaning station, which is perhaps the most visible and easiest to observe example of reef mutualism. At certain locations on the reef, often near prominent coral heads or along reef edges, small fish called cleaner wrasses establish territories. These fish, typically striped with bright blue and black, have a distinctive way of swimming, bouncing up and down in the water column, advertising their presence and their services. Larger fish notice these signals and approach. When a fish wants to be cleaned, it often adopts a specific posture, hovering in place, sometimes with its mouth open or its gill covers lifted, signals that tell the cleaner it's safe to approach, and that the visit is for cleaning, not for eating. The cleaner wrasse moves over the client fish's body, inspecting it carefully, picking off parasites, dead scales, mucus, and other material. The cleaner may swim into the client's mouth, checking between teeth. It may enter the gill cavity, one of the most vulnerable areas for any fish, yet the client remains calm, allowing access. For its efforts, the cleaner gets a meal, sometimes removing dozens or hundreds of parasites from a single client. The client benefits by having parasites removed, which can improve health, reduce disease transmission, and potentially extend lifespan. But cleaner wrasses aren't the only cleaners on the reef. In the Caribbean and other regions, cleaner gobies and cleaner shrimp also establish stations. Some cleaner shrimp, particularly the Pacific cleaner shrimp and the Caribbean peppermint cleaner shrimp, are so effective that even large predators like moray eels will visit them for cleaning. There's something almost surreal about watching a moray eel, a fish that could easily swallow a shrimp whole, sitting completely still, while a tiny shrimp crawls over its teeth and into its mouth to remove parasites. Recent research has revealed that cleaning relationships are even more complex than previously thought. Multiple cleaner species sometimes work simultaneously on the same client, with cleaner shrimp and cleaner gobies both servicing a single large fish at the same time. The cleaners appear to coordinate their efforts, focusing on different areas of the client's body. Client fish show preferences for certain cleaning stations and will return to the same locations repeatedly, suggesting they remember where they received good service. The importance of cleaning to reef health has been demonstrated through removal experiments. When scientists have excluded cleaner wrasses from areas of reef, the health of resident fish populations declined. Fish showed increased rates of infection, slower growth, and reduced condition. The diversity and abundance of fish species also decreased in areas without cleaners, suggesting that cleaning services influence where fish choose to live. Interestingly, there are cheaters in this system. The saber-toothed blenny is a small fish that looks remarkably similar to cleaner wrasses, but doesn't clean. Instead, it uses its resemblance to cleaners to approach larger fish, then darts in and bites a chunk of flesh from the unsuspecting client before fleeing. This is called aggressive mimicry, where the mimic gains an advantage by deceiving its victim. The existence of these cheaters creates an evolutionary pressure for both cleaners to maintain honest signals, and for clients to be discriminating about which fish they trust. Beyond cleaning relationships, many other mutualistic partnerships structure the reef community. Clownfish and sea anemones represent one of the most famous examples. Clownfish live among the stinging tentacles of certain anemone species, protected from predators by the anemone's nematocysts, to which the clownfish are somehow immune, possibly through a mucus coating or behavioral adaptations. In return, the clownfish defend the anemone from anemone-eating fish, like butterfly fish, may bring food to the anemone, and their waste products provide nutrients. The clownfish and anemone benefit so much from this partnership that they're rarely found apart. Gobies and pistol shrimp form another classic partnership. The pistol shrimp, nearly blind, excavates a burrow in sand or rubble near the reef. The goby, which has excellent vision, stands guard at the burrow entrance, watching for predators. The shrimp maintains constant physical contact with the goby using its antennae, and when the goby sees a threat and flicks its tail, the shrimp immediately retreats into the burrow, pulling the goby with it if necessary. Both species benefit. The shrimp gets a sentry, and the goby gets a home. Some crabs carry sea anemones on their claws, using the anemone's stinging tentacles as weapons to deter predators. The boxer crab is a small crab that holds a tiny anemone in each claw, waving them like pom-poms when threatened. The anemones benefit by being transported to different feeding locations and by consuming scraps from the crab's meals. There are also numerous commensal relationships, where one species benefits, while the other is neither helped nor harmed significantly. Remoras, fish with modified dorsal fins that function as suction cups, attach to sharks, rays, and other large fish, getting free transportation and access to food scraps from their host's meals. The host typically receives no benefit from this arrangement, but is also not significantly harmed. Porcelain crabs live among the tentacles of sea anemones, filter feeding on particles in the water while gaining protection from the anemone. The anemone is presumably indifferent to the crab's presence. Some relationships are more complex and harder to categorize. Do parrotfish benefit reefs by eating algae and preventing overgrowth? Yes, but they also damage corals with their scraping feeding behavior. Are they mutualists, or are they grazers that happen to provide a service? The answer may depend on how you frame the question and what timescale you consider. Giant clams host zooxanthellae in their mantle tissue, much like corals do, and similarly benefit from the photosynthetic products these algae produce. Unlike corals, however, giant clams are highly mobile during their larval stage and can close their shells for protection, making them somewhat less vulnerable to environmental stress. But like corals, they suffer when they lose their zooxanthellae, and they can experience bleaching events similar to corals when water temperatures rise. Sponges provide microhabitat for numerous small invertebrates and fish that live within their channels and chambers. Some gobies are obligate sponge dwellers, never found outside the sponge species they inhabit. The sponge gains nothing obvious from these residents, but the relationship persists, suggesting there may be subtle benefits we haven't yet identified. These relationships, from the essential to the incidental, create a web of dependencies that make reef ecosystems both resilient and vulnerable. Resilient because the redundancy of relationships means that the loss of one species can sometimes be compensated by others filling similar roles. Vulnerable because the loss of keystone species, those that have disproportionately large effects on the ecosystem, can trigger cascades of changes that destabilize the entire system. Understanding these relationships helps us predict and respond to reef changes. If we know that parrotfish are crucial for controlling algae, we can prioritize their protection from overfishing. If we understand that cleaner fish services influence where other fish live, we can recognize cleaning stations as critical habitat worthy of special protection. If we appreciate that corals depend absolutely on their zooxanthellae, we can understand why bleaching events are so devastating and why preventing temperature rise is essential for reef survival. The more we learn about coral reef partnerships, the more we realize how interconnected everything is, how the health of one species affects others, how disturbances ripple through the ecosystem in ways both obvious and subtle. This interconnection is beautiful, a testament to the power of evolution to forge relationships that make the whole greater than the sum of its parts. But it also means that protecting coral reefs requires understanding and maintaining all these relationships, not just the corals themselves or the most charismatic fish species, but the entire community of organisms that together create and sustain these extraordinary ecosystems. Coral reefs don't just appear randomly across the ocean floor. They form in specific patterns shaped by geology, ocean currents, and the growth characteristics of the corals themselves. Understanding these patterns helps us see reefs not as isolated structures, but as products of deep time, of geological processes and biological persistence operating over thousands or millions of years. The modern understanding of reef formation begins with Charles Darwin, who, during his voyage on the HMS Beagle in the early 1800s, made careful observations of different reef types across the Pacific. Darwin noticed that coral reefs seem to come in three main forms: fringing reefs that grew close to shore, barrier reefs that paralleled coastlines but were separated by lagoons, and atolls, ring-shaped reefs surrounding central lagoons with no landmass in the center. Darwin proposed an elegant theory to explain this progression. He suggested that reefs began as fringing reefs growing around the shoreline of a volcanic island. As the island slowly subsided, sinking as the volcanic rock cooled and became denser, the corals would continue growing upward, keeping pace with the sinking land. Eventually, a lagoon would form between the reef and the island, creating a barrier reef. If the subsidence continued until the island disappeared entirely beneath the waves, all that would remain would be the ring of coral, an atoll with a deep central lagoon marking where the island once stood. Darwin had no way to test this theory directly, as the timescales involved were far too long for observation. But he made a prediction. If his theory was correct, drilling down through an atoll should reveal volcanic rock beneath the coral, the remains of the original island. Over a century later, after Darwin's death, scientists did exactly that. They drilled into atolls in the Pacific and found, beneath hundreds of meters of coral rock, basaltic volcanic rock, exactly as Darwin had predicted. His theory of atoll formation has been validated and refined, standing as one of the great achievements of 19th century natural history. Today, we understand the mechanisms behind Darwin's observations. Volcanic islands form at hotspots, or along tectonic boundaries. When a volcanic island first emerges, it's too high and steep for coral reefs to form. But as erosion and weathering begin to create shallower areas around the island's base, and as the volcano becomes dormant and begins to cool and settle, conditions become suitable for reef development. Coral larvae settle on the rocky substrate and begin building, growing upward and outward, trying to stay in the zone where sunlight can reach their zooxanthellae. The rate at which corals can grow upward, typically a few millimeters to a few centimeters per year, depending on species and conditions, must match or exceed the rate of island subsidence for a reef to survive. If subsidence is too rapid, corals find themselves in water too deep for adequate light, and the reef drowns. If subsidence is very slow or non-existent, the reef may not progress beyond a fringing reef. The balance between coral growth and island subsidence determines reef development over millennia. Fringing reefs are the most common type of reef, found along coastlines throughout the tropics. These reefs grow directly from the shore, often with no lagoon or only a very shallow lagoon separating them from land. You can sometimes walk on fringing reefs at low tide, though this damages the reef and should be avoided. The reef flat, the shallow area on top of the reef, is often exposed during extreme low tides, revealing tide pools filled with trapped fish and invertebrates. Just beyond the reef flat is the reef crest, where waves break most intensely, and then the forereef slope, which drops away into deeper water. The largest fringing reef in the world is the Ningaloo Reef in Western Australia, stretching for over 250 kilometers along the coast. Unlike most major reefs, which are offshore, Ningaloo lies close to shore, making it easily accessible and allowing visitors to wade or swim short distances to reach spectacular coral gardens. This accessibility also makes it vulnerable to human impacts, and careful management is required to balance tourism, fishing, and conservation. Barrier reefs are less common, but include some of the world's most famous reef systems. The Great Barrier Reef, visible from space and stretching over 2,000 kilometers along Australia's northeast coast, is actually not a single reef, but a complex of nearly 3,000 individual reefs and 900 islands. It developed over the past 8,000 years as sea levels rose following the last ice age, flooding the continental shelf and creating ideal conditions for reef growth. The reef lies kilometers offshore in some areas, separated from the mainland by a lagoon that can be tens of meters deep. This separation creates distinct ecological zones, with the lagoon supporting different communities than the outer reef slope. Other major barrier reefs include the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef in the Caribbean, the second longest in the world, stretching from Mexico through Belize and Guatemala to Honduras, and the New Caledonian Barrier Reef in the Pacific, which surrounds the island of New Caledonia in a nearly continuous ring. Atolls are perhaps the most intriguing reef formation because they reveal most clearly the interplay between geological and biological processes. An atoll from above looks like a giant ring, often roughly circular or oval, with a lagoon in the center and narrow strips of coral and sand islands around the perimeter. The lagoon can be quite deep, sometimes over 50 meters, and is connected to the open ocean by channels through the reef. Some atolls are enormous, with lagoons dozens of kilometers across, while others are small, just a few kilometers in diameter. Atolls are found primarily in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, particularly in regions far from continental landmasses. The Maldives is an entire nation of atolls, a double chain of coral reefs in the Indian Ocean, with lagoons that have supported human habitation for thousands of years. The Marshall Islands, the Caroline Islands, and countless other Pacific archipelagos consist primarily or entirely of atolls. The formation of an atoll can take millions of years, representing the entire life cycle of a volcanic island, from emergence to disappearance. Some atolls sit on top of seamounts, underwater mountains that never quite reached the surface, but came close enough for corals to colonize their peaks. Others sit on older reef foundations, with corals growing on top of earlier generations of reefs that formed during previous periods of suitable conditions. Within any reef, whether fringing, barrier, or atoll, there exists a characteristic zonation pattern, areas with distinct physical conditions that support different communities. The reef crest experiences the highest wave energy, the strongest sunlight, and the greatest exchange with open ocean water. This zone is dominated by fast-growing, wave-resistant corals like branching acropora species, along with encrusting coralline algae that can withstand the constant pounding. The reef flat behind the crest is shallower and may experience greater temperature fluctuations and periods of exposure during low tides. Different coral species dominate here, often more massive, heat-tolerant forms. The back reef, or lagoon, typically has murkier water, less wave action, and may support seagrass beds or different coral communities adapted to lower light and more variable conditions. The forereef slope, dropping away from the reef crest into deeper water, is often where coral diversity is highest. This zone receives good light, but is protected from the most violent wave action. Water quality is usually excellent due to constant flushing by ocean currents. Different sections of the slope support different communities, with light-loving branching and plating corals in the shallows, transitioning to more massive and plating forms deeper down, where corals must maximize their surface area to capture diminishing light. At the base of the reef slope, where the reef meets the sand or rubble of the seafloor, yet another community exists, dominated by species that can tolerate lower light and sediment. Some reefs drop away into very deep water, with their bases lying in darkness hundreds of meters below the surface. These deep reefs remain poorly studied, though recent research using submersibles and technical diving has revealed communities of corals and other organisms thriving in these dim environments, possibly representing refuges where corals can escape the worst effects of surface warming. Understanding reef geography helps us recognize that not all parts of a reef are equivalent. Different zones have different exposures to stress, different community compositions, and different potential resilience to disturbances. Protection and management strategies need to account for this variation, ensuring that representative examples of all reef zones and reef types are conserved. Additionally, the connections between different reef zones matter. Larvae produced on the reef crest may settle in the lagoon. Fish that feed in the lagoon may shelter on the forereef slope at night. Nutrients and sediments that affect the back reef often originate from land. These spatial connections mean that managing reefs effectively requires thinking about them as integrated systems with linked parts, not as collections of isolated spots. The geological history embedded in reef structures also provides information crucial for predicting their futures. By studying how reefs responded to past sea level changes, past temperature fluctuations, and past periods of environmental stress preserved in the reef's geological record, scientists can develop models of how reefs might respond to ongoing and future changes. The coral skeletons themselves are climate archives, with growth bands and geochemical signatures recording ocean conditions year by year, sometimes for centuries. These records reveal that reefs have survived significant environmental changes in the past, but they also show that recovery from major disturbances can take decades or centuries, and that some shifts, once they occur, may be effectively irreversible on human timescales. Beneath the waves, communication takes forms we might not recognize as language, but that serve similar purposes, coordinating behavior, transmitting information, facilitating cooperation and competition. Coral reefs may seem silent to our ears, but they're alive with chemical signals, electrical impulses, and other forms of communication that create invisible networks linking organisms across the ecosystem. The most fundamental communication on the reef is chemical. Water is an excellent medium for transmitting chemical signals, and many reef organisms use scent as their primary means of detecting and interpreting their environment. When a fish is injured, it releases alarm substances that can be detected by other fish, warning them of danger. Some species respond to these alarm chemicals by hiding or by changing their behavior to reduce risk. Predators, conversely, may be attracted to these same chemicals, homing in on signs of weakness or injury. Chemical communication is essential for reproduction. During spawning, corals and many other invertebrates release gametes that carry chemical cues. These cues can trigger spawning in nearby colonies, helping to synchronize the mass spawning events we discussed earlier. The mechanisms are still being studied, but it appears that some corals can detect when neighbors are releasing gametes and respond by releasing their own, creating a cascade of spawning that ripples across the reef. Fish use chemical signals for territory marking, courtship, and species recognition. Many fish can recognize individuals or family members by their chemical signatures. Gobies, for instance, can distinguish between familiar and unfamiliar individuals of their own species based on scent alone, allowing them to maintain complex social structures in environments where visual cues might be limited. The coral zooxanthellae partnership itself involves chemical communication. The zooxanthellae signal their presence and health status to the coral host, while the coral signals its needs to the symbionts. This communication regulates the flow of nutrients and photosynthetic products between the partners. When this signaling breaks down, as it does during bleaching, the carefully balanced partnership destabilizes, leading to the expulsion of zooxanthellae. But chemical communication extends beyond individual partnerships to shape whole communities. There's growing evidence that corals may be able to detect chemical signals from neighboring corals, allowing them to respond to competition or coordinate defenses against threats. Some corals release allelopathic chemicals, substances that inhibit the growth of competing organisms, essentially engaging in chemical warfare with their neighbors. Other corals may produce defensive compounds when attacked by crown-of-thorns sea stars or other predators, signaling to nearby corals to increase their own defenses. The network of communication extends beneath the reef surface as well. Recent research has revealed that corals and other reef organisms are connected through vast networks of microbial communities. The bacteria and other microorganisms that live on and within coral tissue, in the water column and in the sediment, aren't just passive residents. They actively mediate nutrient cycling, help defend against pathogens, and facilitate communication between different parts of the reef ecosystem. This microbial dimension of reef function is just beginning to be understood. Scientists have identified thousands of bacterial species associated with coral reefs, many of them performing crucial roles in nitrogen fixation. converting atmospheric nitrogen into forms that corals and other organisms can use. Other bacteria help cycle nutrients, breaking down organic matter and making nutrients available. Some bacteria produce antibiotics that protect corals from disease. The loss of these beneficial bacterial communities, which can occur when corals are stressed, may make reefs more vulnerable to disease and less resilient to disturbance. There's even evidence for something that might be called a reef immune system, a distributed network of defensive mechanisms that operates across the entire ecosystem. When one part of the reef is attacked by disease or predators, chemical signals can prime defenses in other parts of the reef, preparing them for potential threats. This isn't a conscious response, of course, but rather an emergent property of the chemical communication networks that link reef organisms together. Some reef researchers have drawn parallels between these chemical communication networks and the wood wide web found in forests, where fungi connect the roots of different trees and facilitate nutrient exchange and communication. On reefs, the connecting medium is primarily water rather than fungal threads, but the principle may be similar. Individual organisms are not as separate as they appear, but are instead nodes in a larger network of exchange and interaction. Sound also plays a role in reef communication, though it's less well understood than chemical signaling. Many reef fish produce sounds, either through muscle contractions that vibrate their swim bladder, or through grinding their teeth. These sounds serve various functions, from attracting mates to defending territories to communicating distress. Some researchers have even recorded the overall soundscape of healthy reefs, noting that healthy reefs are noisy places, crackling with the sounds of snapping shrimp, grunting fish, and other biological activity. Degraded reefs, by contrast, are quieter, lacking the diversity and abundance of sound-producing organisms. Recent experiments have used recordings of healthy reef sounds to attract fish larvae to degraded reefs, essentially using sound as a restoration tool. The idea is that larvae use sound cues when searching for settlement habitat, and by broadcasting the sounds of a healthy reef, researchers can make degraded sites more attractive to settling larvae. Early results are promising, suggesting that understanding reef communication might lead to novel approaches to reef restoration. Light communication exists as well, though it's less common than chemical or acoustic signaling. Some fish and invertebrates produce bioluminescence, and while this is more characteristic of deep-sea environments, it does occur on shallow reefs as well. Bioluminescence can serve as camouflage, making an organism's silhouette less visible from below by matching the dim light filtering down from the surface. It can attract prey, lure mates, or startle predators. Some squid that visit reefs have elaborate bioluminescent displays used in courtship, flashing patterns of light along their bodies in sequences that can communicate species identity, sex, and receptiveness. The complexity of reef communication systems suggests that reefs function as integrated entities rather than as collections of independent organisms. The loss of key species doesn't just remove those organisms. It also disrupts communication pathways, breaks connections, and potentially degrades the reef's ability to coordinate responses to stress. This may help explain why reef degradation can accelerate once it begins. As communication breaks down, the reef loses resilience, becoming less able to mount collective responses to threats, less able to recover from disturbances, less able to maintain the complex coordination that healthy reefs require. Understanding these hidden networks of communication remains one of the frontiers of reef science. Most communication signals are invisible to us, occurring in chemical concentrations we can't detect, without instruments, in acoustic frequencies we may not hear, through biological pathways we're only beginning to map. As our tools improve and our knowledge deepens, we're discovering that coral reefs are far more connected, far more communicative than we previously recognized. This knowledge has profound implications for conservation, suggesting that protecting reefs means protecting not just the visible organisms, but also the invisible infrastructure of communication and exchange that allows reefs to function as ecosystems. It would be dishonest to speak about coral reefs without acknowledging the grave threats they face. The reality is stark. Coral reefs globally are in serious decline, with over half of the world's reefs degraded to some degree, and some regions having lost more than 90% of their living coral cover. The causes are multiple, often interacting, and in most cases, directly or indirectly linked to human activities. Yet alongside this honest assessment of the threats must come recognition of reefs' capacity for resilience, the ways they can recover if given the chance, and the efforts underway to protect and restore these vital ecosystems. The most immediate and visible threat to coral reefs is climate change, manifested primarily through rising ocean temperatures. Corals have narrow temperature tolerances, adapted through evolution to specific thermal ranges. When water temperatures rise just 1 or 2 degrees Celsius above the normal summer maximum, corals experience heat stress. Their metabolism increases. Their symbiosis with zooxanthellae becomes unbalanced, and they respond by expelling the zooxanthellae in a desperate attempt to survive the stress. This is coral bleaching, and it's happening with increasing frequency and severity. Major bleaching events have occurred on coral reefs worldwide in 1998, 2010, and most devastatingly during 2014 through 2017, when an unprecedented global bleaching event affected 70% of coral reefs worldwide. On the Great Barrier Reef, back-to-back bleaching in 2016 and 2017 killed approximately half of the coral in some areas, particularly in the northern sections where temperatures were highest. Not all bleached corals die. If temperatures return to normal quickly enough, corals can reacquire zooxanthellae from the water and recover, though recovery can take years and the corals remain vulnerable during this period. However, if bleaching is severe or prolonged, or if other stresses are present, mortality rates can be very high. Dead corals quickly become covered with algae, and the reef transitions from a SGE, coral-dominated, to an algae-dominated state. Without living corals actively growing and maintaining the structure, the reef framework begins to erode, losing the three-dimensional complexity that makes reefs such valuable habitat. Ocean acidification represents a second, more insidious threat from rising carbon dioxide levels. When CO2 from the atmosphere dissolves in seawater, it forms carbonic acid, which increases ocean acidity and reduces the concentration of carbonate ions available for calcification. This makes it harder for corals to build their skeletons and for other calcifying organisms, like coralline algae, mollusks, and some plankton, to create shells. While the effects of acidification are more subtle than those of bleaching, they're no less serious. Corals in more acidic water grow more slowly, produce weaker skeletons, more vulnerable to storm damage, and have reduced ability to recover from injuries. There's an insidious interaction between warming and acidification. Regions that experience less warming, and therefore less bleaching, also accumulate more dissolved carbon dioxide over time, leading to greater acidification. Conversely, regions where warming is rapid experience severe bleaching, but may have slightly less acidification. This creates a double bind for coral reefs. There's no safe haven that avoids both threats simultaneously. Beyond climate change, coral reefs face a host of more local threats, often called local stressors, to distinguish them from the global climate threat. Pollution from land-based sources is among the most damaging. Sediment runoff from coastal development, agriculture, and deforestation smothers corals, blocking light from reaching their zooxanthellae and directly damaging delicate tissues. Nutrient pollution from sewage and agricultural fertilizers alters reef ecosystems by promoting algae growth, which can outcompete corals for space, and turn reefs from coral-dominated to algae-dominated systems. Overfishing disrupts reef food webs and can have cascading effects. When herbivorous fish like parrotfish are removed by fishing, algae can proliferate unchecked, preventing coral recovery and recruitment. The loss of top predators like groupers and sharks alters prey populations and can lead to mesopredator release, where mid-level predators increase in abundance and put greater pressure on lower trophic levels. The selective removal of large, old, reproductively valuable individuals, particularly at spawning aggregations, can have disproportionate effects on fish population dynamics and genetic diversity. Destructive fishing practices, including blast fishing and cyanide fishing, directly kill corals over large areas. Though these practices are illegal in most countries, they persist in regions where enforcement is weak or where poverty drives desperate measures. Coastal development destroys reefs directly through dredging, filling, and construction. Even development that doesn't directly remove reef can damage nearby reefs through increased sedimentation, pollution, and physical disturbance. Tourism, while economically important and potentially a force for conservation, can also damage reefs through physical contact, anchor damage, and pollution, if not carefully managed. Disease outbreaks on coral reefs have increased in frequency and severity in recent decades. Stony coral tissue loss disease, first identified in Florida in 2014, has spread through the Caribbean, killing vast areas of coral. White band disease, black band disease, and numerous other coral diseases affect different species and regions, often with mortality rates approaching 100% in affected colonies. The causes of these disease outbreaks are complex and probably involve multiple factors, including elevated temperatures, pollution, and the introduction of novel pathogens. Crown of thorns sea star outbreaks, while natural phenomena, appear to be increasing in frequency on some reefs, possibly due to nutrient runoff increasing larval survival. These sea stars consume coral tissue, and major outbreaks can devastate large areas of reef. Yet, despite all these threats, coral reefs demonstrate remarkable resilience under the right conditions. Resilience refers to an ecosystem's ability to absorb disturbance while maintaining its basic structure and function, and to recover after disturbances. Reefs have survived major environmental changes in the past, including sea level fluctuations of over 100 meters during ice age cycles, temperature changes of several degrees, and previous periods of ocean acidification. The question isn't whether reefs can survive change, it's whether they can survive the rate and magnitude of current changes, and weather will give them the opportunity to adapt. Resilience on coral reefs comes from several sources. Genetic diversity within coral populations means that some individuals may have greater tolerance to heat, disease, or other stresses. These tolerant individuals can survive disturbances and potentially pass their advantageous traits to future generations. The diversity of coral species, with different species having different tolerances and life strategies, provides redundancy, so that if one species is lost, others may fill similar roles. The structural complexity of reefs provides refuge for organisms during disturbances, allowing populations to persist and recolonize affected areas once conditions improve. Connectivity between reefs, maintained by larval dispersal through ocean currents, allows damaged reefs to be resupplied with coral larvae from healthier source populations. This connectivity has made it possible for reefs to recover from local disturbances in the past, though it also means that impacts in one location can affect reefs far downstream. Conservation efforts are underway globally to protect and restore coral reefs. Marine protected areas, where fishing and other extractive activities are restricted or prohibited, have been shown to improve reef resilience by allowing fish populations to recover, particularly herbivores that keep algae in check. Even partial protection, where some activities are restricted while others are allowed, can provide benefits. Reducing local stresses, particularly pollution and overfishing, can improve reefs' ability to withstand climate impacts. Reefs that are otherwise healthy and well managed are more likely to survive bleaching events and recover afterwards than reefs that are also dealing with pollution, overfishing, and other local problems. Active restoration efforts are expanding, with scientists and communities working to grow corals in nurseries and transplant them to degraded reefs. While restoration can't solve the global climate problem, it can help rebuild reef structure in key areas, restore fish habitat, protect coastlines, and maintain genetic diversity while we work on the larger climate challenge. Research into coral adaptation and evolution is revealing that some corals are more resilient to heat and acidification than others, and that these traits may be heritable. Efforts are underway to identify and propagate heat-tolerant corals, potentially using selective breeding or assisted evolution to enhance coral resilience. These approaches are controversial, raising questions about human intervention in natural systems, but they may prove necessary if we hope to preserve coral reefs through this century. Perhaps most fundamentally, addressing the climate crisis is essential. Without significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, ocean temperatures will continue to rise, and acidification will worsen, eventually exceeding even the most resilient coral's ability to adapt. Multiple climate models suggest that coral reefs could face annual severe bleaching events within decades under high-emission scenarios, making recovery between disturbances impossible and leading to widespread reef collapse. Yet, there are reasons for hope. Global awareness of reef threats is higher than ever. Governments, NGOs, scientists, and local communities are working together on reef conservation and restoration at unprecedented scales. The Paris Climate Agreement, while imperfect and still insufficient, represents international recognition that climate change must be addressed. Renewable energy technologies are improving rapidly and becoming more economically competitive. The knowledge and tools needed to protect reefs better than ever before exist. Coral reefs have survived for millions of years through ice ages and hot periods, through asteroid impacts and volcanic eruptions, through countless local and regional disasters. They've proven their resilience time and again. The question now is whether we, as the species whose activities have created this crisis, will provide reefs with the conditions they need to continue. Will we reduce our emissions enough to prevent the worst warming scenarios? Will we protect reefs from local stresses to give them their best chance at survival? Will we invest in restoration and adaptation to help bridge the gap between the reefs we have and the reefs we need? The answers to these questions will determine whether future generations know coral reefs only from books and recordings, or whether they'll have the privilege, as we still do, of descending into these underwater cities, watching polyps extend their tentacles into the current, seeing fish gather at cleaning stations, witnessing spawning events that fill the water with potential, and feeling themselves part of an ancient and ongoing story of life, cooperation, and persistence. We've travelled far tonight, from the smallest polyp to the largest reef, from the secrets of night to the spectacle of spawning, from the partnerships that build reefs to the threats that endanger them. We've explored the hidden architecture of cooperation, the silent conversations of chemistry, the deep time embedded in reef stones, and the urgent present where all these wonders hang in balance. Coral reefs teach us that complexity emerges from simplicity, that cooperation can be more powerful than competition, that beauty and fragility often exist together, and that what seems permanent can change in ways we don't expect, for better or worse. These are ecosystems worth protecting, not just for their ecological services or economic value, though both are substantial, but for what they represent. Living proof that partnerships can create abundance, that diversity creates resilience, that life, given time and space, builds extraordinary things. If you found this journey into the secret life of coral reefs meaningful, please like this video and subscribe to Bedtime Biology for more calm explorations of the natural world. Share in the comments where you're checking in from, and if you've ever had the privilege of experiencing a coral reef, share that story as well. Every comment, every like, every share helps us reach others who might find comfort and wonder in these nocturnal explorations of science and nature. Thank you for spending this time in the underwater cities with me. Sleep well, dream of coral gardens, and remember that even in the deepest darkness, life finds a way to create light.